Hello there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Metagame, the live streaming show here on the Dice Tower with your host, Chaz Marler, where we talk about board games, but also talk about talking about board games. And this episode of The Metagame almost not brought to you by your computer just sitting there not doing anything. Do you have something really important scheduled to do, but you really like watching those little buffer spinners spin? Well, then you should try having your computer just sitting there not doing anything. It's fun. So as soon as I get a confirmation that the audio and video is okay, which sounds like it is, other than the massive weird fungal ball that apparently has lodged itself in my trachea, we will start the show. And today's show is going to be all about expansions. And this comment was posted on one of the BGG forums, and someone wanted to talk about expansions and really the potential annoyance of expansions. And I got to think about this, wondering how could expansions be annoying? But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, I can see this, especially if there are expansions that fall into certain criterion that we will discuss as the show goes along. If you are in the live streaming chat watching this show and you do want to participate in it, you are welcome to do so because there are several ways. Let's see here. I have pictures of microwaves queued up. Nope, that's not it. It's going to be this guy and this guy. Hey, it's those guys. The hashtag TMG will be your gateway to getting involved in today's chat. Because what I'm going to do is I have my YouTube chat set up here, and I am going to use my web browser's search tool to search for the TMG hashtag, and those comments that have that hashtag are going to be highlighted and kind of bubble up to the top. So if you want to get involved in today's discussion, do so in that manner with that hashtag in your post. So what are we talking about today? I mentioned briefly expansions. So what specifically about expansions can we talk about? Well, first thing I want to know is if there is a certain amount of time that theoretically should pass before an expansion is released after a base game. Every now and then you will hear of a game on Kickstarter or even a game being released, and the game has been announced or has its Kickstarter running, and it's not even available yet. And the publisher already announces a expansion that they have planned for it. And the general consensus in response to that is, oh, why didn't you just put what's in your expansion in the base game if you're working on it already so soon? Now, I can understand the potential of wanting to get your game to market and therefore having certain things in it that you design and you have additional ideas, and perhaps there is not time or financial resources to bundle all that together into your initial package offering. But at the same time, what? We don't even have the game yet and you're making an expansion? So that's the first question. The first bullet point on my list of topics to discuss is, how much time should pass between the release of a base game and its expansions? Do you guys have any opinion on that matter? And before I get to the next item on my bullet list, let us go to the chat and see what people are saying about that already. So let me do my old search here for TMG. Hello, search tool. It's been a while. Search tool, my old friend. We are going to start here with wherever the chat currently happens to be, which is with Kabuki Kid, who says that speaking as Kabuki, not as myself now, this is as this person, Kabuki says, I already bought all of the expansions for 7th Continent along with the Kickstarter base game. So you're saying that you, at the same time that you purchased 7th Continent, you purchased all of its expansions as well? If that's the case, let's follow up on that. Zap me another comment here to follow up, because what I want to know is, were these expansions that were developed at the same time the base game was developed? Or were these just, it's been a while that the game has been available for a while and you haven't picked it up yet. So while you're picking it up, even though you haven't played it and it's brand new to you, you decided to get all the expansions that were available at that time when you're scooping up the base game, which was a bullet point idea I had on my list for later. And then also, how many expansions are there for Seventh Continent at this point, and when did they come out? So, Kabuki, there's some homework that I'm giving you right off the bat. I would like to know the follow-up on those. And while that's being worked on, let's continue to the next comment here in the chat, which is from Steph Stargirl, who says, "My first time on here. Welcome, Steph. It's always great to meet new people here in the chat this way, or at least meet their avatars. So thank you for joining us." But Steph continues to say, "I rarely buy an expansion." Oh, interesting. This will be an interesting case study. "I rarely buy an expansion, only if I really like the game and have played it many times. Even then, we still often prefer the basic version with fewer rules." And that is a very good point and a very good reason for being hesitant to invest in expansions, I think, because you'll have increased complexity for the game. And I know there have been some games, one in particular was Among the Stars. I went like Kabuki did. I scooped up all the expansions when I got the base game, and without thinking, before ever playing it the first time, dumped all the expansions into the base game. And when game day came to play it, then we were overwhelmed and it was too complex, and we had to actually dial back and back off of the game and actually dissect all of the expansions out of the base game and played it a couple times, just the base game, and slowly introduce those expansions. So Steph, I can totally see where you're coming from there about how often you can prefer the basic version with fewer rules, especially when you're starting out with the game. That's a good question. Has anyone out there ever experienced that sort of expansion overload? Are expansions prone to overwhelming new players? And is there a certain way that expansions should be introduced? Or if you are familiar with the game and you are an expert at it, and when you teach it, do you include all the expansions when you teach the game to a new player? Or do you leave them out and slowly introduce them? Let's find out what the next person in the old chatteroony has to say. Here we go. Next highlighted chat here is from regular visitor and friend of the show, Toyota Wolf, who says, "I think expansions are awesome. A lot of times they can carry on a story or add more content that can really expand a game. But as I had said, I am a completionist. I have completionist syndrome. So yeah, that can be annoying." That is one thing I was wondering when that would come up. And that is the tendency as gamers to be completionists. There are multiple games that I have had in which I have not played the game very frequently anymore. It's still on my shelf and it's still a game that I enjoy. But yes, I will continue to scoop up the expansions, and for no other reason than just kind of completionism. And it's something that I've tried to stop doing as much. I've picked several games and said, okay, I'm done with these games. Unless I start playing this every week for a few months, I'm done getting these. A lot of the games like, Marvel Legendary or Dice Masters and things like that are definitely prone to that sort of completionist and expansion overload and overdoing it that way. So Toyota, even though you says that you feel you are a completionist and you find that annoying, you said that you still find the expansions to be awesome. So I'm just wondering there if you feel conflicted because of that or not. I'm going to check one thing. Oh, no, can't do that. Okay. Sorry. I'm getting a note about some dropped frames today, which is unfortunate. And I was going to try and change a setting, but the setting is unchangeable. So that's, I'm sorry. But we will continue through. Scott from Crits Happen, doesn't have the hashtag in there, but Crits Happen, excellent YouTube channel, one of the 3 YouTube channels that actually inspired me to start doing videos, has chimed in with a comment. So I'm just going to read it because it's my show and I can do that sort of thing, I suppose. But Crits Happen mentions, I think for when expansions should be released, it should be 4 months, 3 days, 2 hours, 1 minute, and 19 seconds before an expansion is released. And I just want to say that is definitely a somewhat that is a very specific expert opinion there. So I want to know how you are tracking that amount of time. Is that from the date of your own purchase, or the dates in the product's announcement, or the date the product ships? There's so many variables in this to really hone in on this number. I want to know if that's the date that the product goes on the ship, or when it hits the store, or what. You have opened a can of worms here that I think needs to be dug through to find the specific worm to really, really hone in on this, because it sounds like you have a definite lead here on how long it should be since the expansions continue. Speaking of continue, let's continue on to the next comment here from Kobuki, who says that, in her opinion, 5th player expansions are usually a really big mistake, if you ask me. Usually they ruin the game. They make it longer than it should be. That the 5th player expansion could be an episode in and of itself, right there, I believe, because I agree that is really a strange anomaly. Because you'll have this game, and many times, almost if not all the time, games are designed for a specific certain player count. And whether that's 3 players or 4 or 5 or whatever, whatever that is going to be the way the game was kind of honed in on when it was designed. And of course, the first thing that happens is a game is popular and people want to play it, and they have their game nights and they want to add another person. So the expansion inevitably comes out with a 5th, 6th, or additional player. And you're right, lots of times it can feel like trying to squeeze in another player into a game that wasn't designed to be played that way. Which raises another question here. Since adding a 5th or additional player is such a common instance when it comes to expansions, what would be a better way to handle this? What would be a better default expansion for game designers to fall back on instead of adding the additional player? Is there one? Or is it popular enough that having the additional player be the default actually makes sense? Is it worth that trade-off, or is there a better solution there? Let me know, either in the chat or the comments below, what you think on that topic as well. We'll get a few more comments, and then we'll go to the next item on my own bullet list here. The next comment is from Jason, who says, expansions are done at the same time, but separately sold to keep base costs down and still release a game that works without it. That is I see some truth in that. However, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Jason. Because where you say that expansions are done at the same time but sold separately to keep base costs down. Well, what about Kickstarter? What about all these stretch goals and these, $90, $120, $150, $200 versions of these games that are produced that throw in all of this extra content? Not necessarily as Kickstarter exclusives, but as stretch goals and other things, and sometimes not even stretch goals, just that is the base game that they produce. So there is potentially could be seen as setting a precedent for doing the opposite of that and not needing to release the expansion separately than the base game. There could be a precedent that says, hey, if your game is quality and is seen as having value, those are going to sell whether you keep the expansions separate or throw them in. So Jason, I can see both sides of that coin there. And I think it's an aspect of the way expansions could be introduced and released that I think a lot of people have some good, strong opinions on. So I would be interested in hearing what the other people have to say on that as well. Whether they think that approach is viable or whether they think that approach actually damages the base game more than it actually helps. So thank you, Jason, for that comment. That's hopefully that will lead to some other discussion on it. But in the meantime, let's continue on with Stefan, who says that there seems to be a big difference in the amount of expansions with respect to Euros and Ameritrash. Some weird exceptions aside, such as Carcassonne. Actually, he says, I'm looking at you, Carcassonne. Stop it. So, Stefan, it sounds like your opinion is that Ameritrash games will have more expansions released for them than Euro games will? Now that's... Oh boy. Now that is an idea that I personally think that would require more study before I could really speak to that intelligently. And even then, I don't know if I'd be able to speak to it intelligently, but I could then speak to it confidently in my ignorance. Because what I would like to do is I think that there could be like a list of the top 100 most popular Euro games and top 100 most popular Ameritrash games and see how many expansions they each of them have. Because I don't know, Stefan. I'm not sure if I agree with you 100% on there. If I interpreted your statement to say that Ameritrash games have more expansions than Euro games, if that is the correct interpretation. I may have missed something in what you're saying. Because I don't know, I see a lot of Euro games having a lot of expansions in addition. I'm trying to just kind of zipping through my memory here of games with expansions, but it's kind of a balance there. So someone out there who knows more about the expansions of certain types of games, edumacate me. Tell me, do you have an opinion on this? Does a certain kind of game, Euro game versus Ameritrash game versus party game versus family game versus whatever, is there a certain genre or type of game that in and of itself, by its nature, lends itself to the more development of expansions? Let me know. All right. And now, well, I'm going to find where the chats were. Let me go over to the next bullet point. Okay. And then actually, Stefan's question actually brings me to my next bullet point, which is ties in very closely to that, because I wanted to know, my next question was thinking about expansions that are released for games, and some games have more than others, made me wonder how many expansions are just too many expansions for a game. 3 examples. I already saw a Cosmic Encounter mentioned in the chat before the computer started working. So I already saw Cosmic Encounter mentioned, and Cosmic Encounter has at least a half dozen different expansions, each one adding a whole stack of new character factions and stuff to play. So that's a lot of expansions released for Cosmic Encounter. For Cosmic Encounter, though, it kind of, to me, doesn't seem like too many. It seems like it kind of fits because it's just adding more content, and to me, in a way, they're expendable. You don't have to get them all. But there have been a lot of expansions for Cosmic Encounter. It has been a little difficult to keep track of them all, and it's on the high side, but it hasn't caused it to be a tipping point where I have said too much and given up. A game, though, that I think nailed it would be Seasons. Seasons had its base game released. Then it had an expansion that introduced a few more cards and some neat concepts, and that was kind of nice. Then Seasons released a second expansion, which added like this moon dice and some other little things, and it was kind of like, okay, Seasons, I can see what you're doing. It didn't feel as necessary as the first expansion, and it looked like you're kind of adding some new spins to the game that aren't really necessary. All right. And then Seasons stopped there. It's like Seasons got the hint, and instead of trying to force out more expansions that weren't necessary, it seems like they moved on. And that's to say, if Seasons was to create some more good cards and things, I would definitely be interested in it. But the fact that they aren't forcing it, it seems like Seasons was an example of a game in which the right amount of expansions were released, possibly. That's just my opinion from my list. But then you have games like Descent, to be honest. Descent, I got into for a while, and I got to the point where every time I turned around and backed out of my driveway, there was another expansion sitting there waiting for me to obtain it. And Descent is a game, one of them, that I got to the point where I actually said, okay, I like this game, I enjoy this game, but I'm done. I have enough of it, and I am not going to invest in any more expansions on this game, because it was getting to the point where whenever I purchased a bunch of games, there was always a Descent expansion sitting there in the pile, eating up some of my game budget, it seemed like. So Descent seemed to be a game where enough is enough, and they aren't getting the hint, and they are producing more. Now, of course, the expansions are good. They add lots of neat content. I'm not saying they're bad expansions, but it just seems like Descent is an example of one of those games that just keeps producing expansions. Perhaps it's because people keep buying them and using them and enjoying them, but we'll see. Okay, so that's how many expansions are too many expansions for a game. Let's work our way towards that and other comments by going back to the chat with the next comment with the hashtag, which will be from Kabuki again, who says, yes, to follow up on the previous chat comment, I bought all of the expansions in that Kickstarter that were developed all at the same time for 7th Continent. The game is releasing this summer. There were like 3 small expansions, if I remember correctly. Oh, and thank you for the clarification. Wow, I thought the 7th Continent had come out at this point. I didn't realize it was coming out this summer. Wow, I remember first hearing about that like 2 years ago. So, okay. So thank you for the clarification on that, Kabuki. David joins us to mention that I bought the first 2 expansions for Pandemic, and I love, that's how he wrote it, love In the Lab, but I wouldn't recommend it in the base experience. Pandemic is a wonderful example of a game with expansions. What's neat about Pandemic's expansions is it seems like each one adds a logical next step to the gameplay. And yes, you're right, David. They can increase the complexity, certainly, and they shouldn't be introduced for brand new players. But the mini game to cure the viruses, some of the other objectives that can be introduced. Yes, I think that the way Pandemic has handled its expansions has been a really good example of kind of a case study in expansion development and release. So thank you for bringing up Pandemic as the expansion. Oh, comment jumpage. So let me redo my search. Sorry about that. Today's show is full of little wrinkles and nuances to make it truly unique with all of the whatnots going on. John joins us to say, what about Scott Alm's current Kickstarter? He offers an expansion, but it seems okay to me since it's mainly just adding to the player count. Well, that is a good question. Is it... It's not adding unique game content. So you're right, that is different. It's not like, hey, we're going to have this neat little side game or extra dice or unique thing that we're plugging in that will change the way the game is played. It's just that he's releasing the expansion for the additional player at the same time. I think that dovetails in a way to a couple of things we've already talked about. Is the extra player in that Kickstarter being tacked on because it's not necessary in the base game? So we run into the problem of the tacking on the extra player as the default expansion problem? Or is it simply that he wanted to give more, but it wasn't necessary for the base game, so he was trying to just kind of give people more value? That's a good question. Again, I think too, actually, keeping that in mind, maybe it is something that needs to be taken more on a game-by-game basis, but I'm not sure. I would need to look in that a little bit more. But thank you, John. That does show a good example of that type of conundrum that we can run into when it comes to expansion development and release. Ryan mentions, if the base game is too expensive, you price people out of the game. That is true. However, sometimes the expansion, when released as a separate product, will be available at a higher price point than it itself would have been if it was included with the base game. For example, if you have a $30 base game, but this extra stuff in it would increase it to a $50 price point, you're increasing, the game by $20. But then the expansion, maybe they take all that stuff, they put it in an expansion box, they package it, they ship it, they produce it. It might be $30. So now instead of being $20 increase, instead of being a $20 price increase for the base game, now you have a $30 price increase if you want to get the base game and in addition its expansion. And what's interesting about that is makes me wonder if the publisher, because you got to think about the publisher as well, if they have to do all of the design and printing and packaging and graphic design for all of that stuff and ship it separately and distribute it separately, I would imagine the publisher is going to be having a lower profit margin on the expansion at $30 than they would have in the base game at $20. So you make a really good point there, Ryan, but it makes me wonder, where is that trade-off? When does it really, if you make fewer sales because the game is slightly more expensive when the expansion is in it, how many fewer sales would you have to make in order to justify making a lower profit margin having the expansion be sold separately? Because you're going to incur more costs in doing it that way. So I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head, but I would think that's definitely something when it comes to game design and publishing that the publishers also have to keep in mind. So base game price, yes, you're right, definitely a consideration, but I wonder where the trade-off is, where it still makes it worth it to increase the price of the base game. So we'll see. Let's continue on. Let's continue on to Sasha, who joins us to say, it depends. It depends on the game and the expansion. Does the expansion fix the game? Does it bring new ideas or just more what's already there? Does the game need new content ASAP, such as time stories? Excellent example there. I like what you pointed out there, Sasha, that it depends. But you mentioned, does the expansion fix the game? Expansions that fix the game, I think, get in under a lot of people's skin. I think that is one of the points of contention where an expansion that is seen as fixing the base game, people are like, why was this not just included with the base game? That, I think, is a completely different problem to solve than the other half of your statement about just bringing in new ideas and new content. Expansions that elaborate, expand, and bring in new ideas, those are, I think, quite often seen as awesome. They're also seen as not required for the game. And maybe that is the sticking point. Maybe that's the difference. Expansions that fix the game, that are an expansion that is required because it fixes the game, could be definitely an annoyance, whereas an expansion that's not required because it just expands on the game could be seen as, oh, okay, I don't have to get that if I don't want to, so that's cool. So maybe that is one of the cruxes of the argument there. But and I also like how you mentioned with new content like Time Stories. Yes, Time Stories was a game that was just, you could tell when it was designed, when it was built, it was designed for expansions. It was made to have additional modules plug into this thing to tell new stories. The base game, though, that it came with still worked and was a complete gameplay experience. So I think that the expansions for Time Stories definitely fall into that optional additional content role and not fixing a broken base game role. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that. But I think that you have pointed out in your comment there a very important distinction about what makes a good and bad expansion experience. Piotr joins us to say he thinks if the time is less than 6 months from the base game, well, then an expansion smells like DLC or downloadable content from a video game. That, oh boy, DLC. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. That, I don't know about how others feel, but I'm going to go in the personal opinion mode here. But I am of the personal opinion that I do not like it at all when expansions start to feel like DLC, like downloadable content. Like, hey, we give you a little bit of a base game, and here's a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Now, that said, let's go back to what Sasha said about Time Stories. I think Time Stories is an example of a game where its expansions have that DLC feel to them. Now, does that mean I dislike Time Stories and, don't like it because of that? Well, I still enjoy the game experience, but it's not a game that I have on my shelf because I didn't want to make those investments in the expansions that way. I didn't want to get hooked like that, especially after getting Descent finally all taken care of and figured out. I didn't want to introduce a new one. So I think that some games can be designed with a DLC sort of vibe to them, and that is okay. But it is something that will turn off a lot of potential customers, I think, if it is seen as being a gimmick. And if especially if the base game doesn't stand on its own. And like Peter, our buddy Peter said that if it's less than 6 months, if that DLC starts coming out too soon, it could definitely be seen as less more disingenuous in terms of letting the game stand on its own as a solid game. So thank you very much for your comment. I'm sorry for butchering your name. It's not even a very difficult name. I'm having a lot of internal and external technical difficulties today, apparently. Let's continue on with a comment from Zachary, who says, I'm just not one for expansions. When a game comes with expansions, I usually play the base game. If I grow tired, weary, as it were, of the base game to the point where I desire more, well, I usually just move on to a new game. That is the $35 question right there, isn't it? Is one of the purposes of an expansion to breathe new life and sales into an older game, so that instead of having to produce a brand new product from scratch, you can piggyback off an existing product and have less development time, fewer development resources to get an expansion out there, and basically get more sales with less effort. Is that one of the hidden purposes of an expansion in the board game industry? Is it not just, hey, we had more stuff we couldn't fit in the base game, or hey, we got more ideas? Is it sometimes, hey, remember that game you bought last year? It sold good for a few months and we'd like to sell more. So here's some neat stuff to remind you about that game that everyone liked. Yeah, remember? Yeah. Oh, you're picking up the expansion? Pick up the base game as well. Is that also one of the reasons that expansions exist? So, Zachary, you may have just unlocked a whole new perspective on expansions for myself. And let me know, Zachary and others, if you have experienced that feeling about expansions or not. And actually, that brings us to the next couple bullet points, which I'll mention before I go back to the chat here. The other questions were to say, if you could suggest one single must-have expansion, what would it be? For example, I think that the Tuscany expansion for viticulture is seen as one of the, if you enjoy the base game, you have to have this expansions. The expansion. In fact, the expansion has all these modules. It is almost like an expansion. It expands on its own expansions in a way. So, but I have heard that the Tuscany expansion for viticulture is a wonderful one. And also quite pricey. It falls into that category of expansions that are just almost as pricey as the base game it can seem. So it is almost like investing in a whole nother game when you invest just in this game's expansion. The other part of this, of course, the other side of the coin, what are the worst expansions that you have encountered? What expansions have you got that you're like, well, I'm not playing with this, and it just never gets added to the game, or stuff like that? Off the top of my head, just because I mentioned it briefly, the one that always jumps out to me is, again, for Seasons, the second expansion with the moon thing. I never use that when I play Seasons. I play with the more cards and stuff like that, and some things that were introduced in the first expansion. But the whole moon die and moon little stuff, I don't even bother. I don't know. Maybe I've played with it. I barely even ever bother with it. So What are the must-have best expansions you've ever run into, and what is the worst expansion that you've ever encountered? Let me know. And in the meantime, we're going to round out the show by going back to the chat here and getting through as many chat comments now as we possibly can. Starting with, again, Kabuki, who mentions the game Dune. Dune, she says, had a couple expansions, and really neither of them are necessary. One was like a pre-game mini-game that you played to determine starting positioning on the planet. Totally not necessary. Dune's a great game, but the expansions just make the game longer and sometimes more swingy. Not all expansions are great. That should have been the title of this episode. Not all expansions are great, because that's a really good point. I was going to ask you, as I was reading your comment, because I know Rex, Final Days of an Empire, is based on Dune. So I was going to ask if Rex incorporated those expansions from Dune. But hearing about this pre-game mini-game to determine starting position, it sounds like no. It sounds like they didn't bother including that in Rex. And it's because that does seem like it would be kind of a tedious endeavor just to figure out starting position. I also agree that some expansions can make things more swingy and unbalanced. That is definitely something that when you have a base game and you revisit it, designers can be in a different mindset, or if there's a different designer that's involved, can totally change the flow and the pacing and the balance of a game. Definitely something to watch out for when designing expansions. Daniel mentions about completionism. Completionism, I finally, and just like Love from the other commenter, Daniel wrote it that way, finally broke free of Dice Master purchases because of this. Enough is enough. And me, I have enough. I know where you're coming from. I'm curious, how many sets did you end up getting though? Did you get just a base set and a couple? Were you there from day one getting Dice Masters? How much Dice Masters did you accumulate before you finally got satiated with it? I'd like to know either in the comments below or wherever. Be curious to know kind of where your threshold was. Ryan mentions that expansions give people a way in with multiple price points. You don't need all the expansions. That's a very good point there. That yes, when there are multiple expansions, it does allow the player, the purchaser, to pick and choose which ones they want, as long as they're not bundled and they don't fall in that category of fixing a broken game. So that's a really good point too about expansions. In a way, if a game has multiple expansions that each introduce different rules and put different twists on a game, expansions are in a way our real world legacy game for board games. Because if you get these two expansions, but I get these two other different expansions, and they lead to a different gameplay experience in the same base game, legacy environment right there. Yeah. Let's move on to the next question here. The next statement by Ben. Ben shares a feeling with me because Ben says, I hate promo expansions that I can't buy in the store. That is so aggravating. However, one fortunate thing is I have found the Board Game Geek store. It's basically 99% promos and stuff. A lot of promos end up in that store, which is really nice. That helps. I'm not a fan. I think I've mentioned this before of when a Kickstarter has Kickstarter exclusives. That lots of times you can't get in on a Kickstarter for one reason or another, so you miss out. And sometimes those exclusives really add a lot of good content to a game. I am of the mindset where I would think a Kickstarter exclusive being exclusive for 6 to 12 months, that's fair. And then after that 12 months, release the rest of the exclusive content to everyone who couldn't get it in the first place. I think that's a fair approach. And I think that's an approach that everyone should be doing right now, including me. So Ben, I totally commiserate with you, and I know where you're coming from with that, and I share your opinion. Let's find out if I share Stefan's opinion, though, because his next statement is, expansions I am definitely thrilled for, Terraforming Mars. Hellas and Elysium, I believe, is the first expansion coming out for Terraforming Mars. That's good to know. Boy, Terraforming Mars, just a quick sidebar, I am impressed with the amount of traction and momentum Terraforming Mars continues to have. I just released a video about the top games that were the highest I got the most traffic on BGG.com over the month of May, tracking that for a month and load. And Terraforming Mars for the last 2 months has been in the top 10. And I think the expansions maybe are fueling some of that, but I know a lot of people are looking forward to that expansion. So way to go, Terraforming Mars. Good game, by the way. So awesome. And that's definitely an expansion to be looking forward to. SK Jung mentions, if it's an expansion that comes together with Kickstarter, then I will treat it like a promo. But if it's an expansion that came at a later time, it's slightly harder to teach for some strange reason. Oh, that is weird. So the amount of time that passes between the release of the base game and its expansion has had the effect of making it seem slightly harder to teach for you. I wonder if that is your side or on the game's side. Because like we kind of mentioned, if an expansion is designed at the same time as a base game, it might flow into the base game better than if more time has passed and the expansion is developed after some time has passed from the development of the base game. Perhaps the designer isn't approaching the game the same way and they have some new ideas that don't quite blend in as much. So maybe it's not you, SK. Maybe it's a side effect of having time pass. Maybe there's a pro and a con to both sides there. I don't know. But that's a very interesting, though. I've never thought about having how much more difficult it is to teach an expansion if it's been a while since the base game was released. So thank you for your comment. Drew mentions, I am trying hard to slow down my buying. Kickstarters with tons of add-on purchases drive me crazy, and we're the first thing to go. Now, love Gloomhaven's second edition's one price Kickstarter model, and Charterstone, no Kickstarter at all. Did Gloomhaven's, now I'm aware of Gloomhaven's second edition printing that they're doing. Did they add anything into Gloomhaven's second edition? I was under the impression that it was just a reprinting, that there wasn't any additional expansions or anything from the first one being added in. It was just, there you go. What you see is what you get. Let me know, correct me if I'm wrong there. And Charterstone, you're right, no Kickstarter at all. Charterstone, though, by its nature of being a legacy game, which I'm really looking forward to, Charterstone, though, being a legacy game, probably lends itself, I would think, to not being very compatible or easily compatible with expansions, because the game is going to veer off into a very unique direction. And also expansions could kind of reveal spoilers. So that's actually, Drew, that's a really good question. As legacy games continue and become more prevalent, are we going to find that legacy games by their design nature are incompatible or not easily compatible with expansions? That could throw the entire industry as we know it on its head, because a game type that cannot lend itself to expansions, what will we do? We will move on to the next comment, though, as we ponder that to find out. Steph mentions that I have so many games that I have a hard time justifying buying an expansion because it won't get played often enough. Oh, absolutely. Yep. So many games come in. It's like, this is neat. And you get the expansion, you add it in. And it's like, I'm going to play this someday. And then you don't. Absolutely agree that lots of times the idea of an expansion is what drives me to buy it instead of the actual playing of the expansion. So absolutely have some experience with you there as well, Steph. Toyota mentions, I do feel conflicted on expansions sometimes. Things like PACG or X-Wing or Armada, Pathfinder Adventure Card Game, PACG, Imperial Assault or Descent can be hard to stay up to date with. And expensive, ... curse you, FFG. Toyota's words. Oh, that's another really good example. Pathfinder Adventure Card Game. Just real quick, I will mention, I agree there. I got, for the first set, the Skinsaw Massacre, or whatever it was called. It's on my shelf, and I'm looking. Woo, hi. It's in my bag. Darn it. It's covered up. Anyway, the first set, I got all of the 6 expansions or whatever, all the little decks and stuff, and we're actually still working our way through them. But I was so overwhelmed by keeping up with those sets that they were releasing that I haven't got any of the pirate ones or the future ones that they've released. It's just been too much to keep up with. Now I know that Paizo actually slowed down how often they release the expansions for the Pathfinder Adventure card game sets. I believe it used to be monthly and now it's every 2 to 3 months or something. So I think they were aware of overwhelming your audience. So that's another thing to keep in mind with expansions. Too many, too soon will overwhelm your customer and cause them to just tune out. But let's not tune out yet. Let's tune in to another couple of comments here. First one from Kabuki again, who says that the Manhattan Project mini expansion of just the 7 nations adds a nice flavor to the game. Almost a must-own expansion, in my opinion. Thank you for the tip on that one. Toyota mentions, are component upgrades expansions? Ooh, I'm not going to answer that question just yet, other than saying I don't think so. If they're homemade ones that the person makes themselves, and if they add no new rules to the game, I guess I am going to answer it. I think if they add no new rules to the game, they're not expansions. But that is just my component-loving opinion. Mr. Wizikin joins us to say, kind of on topic. Living card games drive me crazy when you cannot truly complete the game without buying the next module in the series. Like the Lord of the Rings card game is bad about this. And what I mean by that is it's extremely difficult to even beat the base game quests without having to buy the expansions. Why can't I be given the tools to beat what's in the box? And actually, we're going to have to wrap up right there because, Mr. Wizzykins, that is a question I have as well. In fact, what is it? The Arkham Horror game, living card game, or was there another one? Rats. One of these recent living card games that was produced by Fantasy Flight. They say that in order to create a complete set of all the cards that you can make for making any legal deck that you want in the game, you need to buy not 1, not 2, but 3 copies of the base game. And this is a living card game. It's not a customizable card game where you're going to have to go out and chase rares and chase packs. It's a living card game where they're giving you everything in the box. But for some reason, in this game, they give you 1/3 of potentially what you need in the box to make all the legal games. And what's better yet, is that they give you plenty of some cards, but not enough of a few others. So if you do go out and for some reason buy 3 copies of the base set, because it's an awesome thing to go and do, now you're going to have way more cards than you could possibly use in a legal deck for a lot of these cards. I personally think that is a very puzzling approach to it. It's almost like they managed to take this living card game and smush together the ideas of an expansion and the base game in one by making the base game itself its own expansion. With wonderfully not great results, if you ask me. But that is just my opinion. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to ask me because we're out of time for this episode. However, you can feel free to ask me in the comments below, or over at wherever I find myself these days, which is usually, there we go, the Pair of Dice Paradise YouTube channel and the Dice Tower YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to both of those places for more board game news, reviews, and commentary such as this. I want to thank everyone who has joined us in the chat today. I really appreciate it. It's really great to have these type of conversations. And in the next week or 2, we will have another episode of the Metagame here on the Dice Tower, and we'll continue the conversation then. In the meantime, take care. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at DicetowerNetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.